The civil war in Sudan turned into humanitarian crises. At the center of this crisis are two generals, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who leads the Sudanese Armed Forces SAF, and Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, commonly known as Hemedti, the head of the Rapid Support Forces RSF, past allies and current enemies. Their past partnership, which saw them join forces in a coup, has unraveled into a fierce power struggle. The shared history that once bound them together has now become the foundation of their current animosity. This resulted into that country has lost tens of thousands of lives and displaced over 11 million people. Millions of Sudanese refugees have sought asylum in neighboring nations such as Chad, Ethiopia, and South Sudan. Let us try to understand this conflict. Before moving forward, do subscribe our YouTube channel. Before explaining the current civil war, it is paramount to understand the recent past of Sudan. Sudan's complex history is characterized by great challenges and transformations. Sudan was an Anglo-Egyptian condominium from 1899 to 1955, with Egypt and the United Kingdom sharing sovereignty, but the British wielding the majority of political and military power. It was established by the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium Agreements of January 19 and July 10, 1899, and with some later modifications, lasted until the formation of the sovereign, independent Republic of the Sudan. The Anglo-Egyptian Agreement of 1953 had outlined the steps to be taken for Sudanese self-rule and self-determination. The Sudan was ruled by Omar Hassan Ahmad al-Bashir from 1989 until 2019. Omar al-Bashir's leadership was a defining and turbulent phase in Sudan's post-colonial history. Significant historical events defined Bashir's presidency when he came to power through a coup in 1989 after serving as an officer in the Sudanese Armed Forces SAF and in the Egyptian military during the condominium era. He managed South Sudan's 2011 secession, guided the nation through the protracted civil war, and ruled over the Darfur War, which broke out in 2003. Authoritarianism and harsh repression were features of Bashir's rule. He used private militias for military operations, enforced a strict interpretation of Sharia law, and sent out morality police to carry out the social and religious requirements of his administration. Additionally, Christians, Shia Muslims, and other minority religious sects were targeted by his rule, along with other religious groups. Sudan protests broke out in Sudanese cities on December 19, 2018, sparked by growing living expenses and deteriorating economic conditions. The protests soon shifted from demanding immediate economic reforms to demanding the resignation of President Omar al-Bashir. International condemnation was directed at the government's use of force in response to these mainly non-violent protests. Al-Bashir responded by proclaiming a state of emergency on February 22, 2019, dissolving the national and provincial governments and installing military and intelligence personnel in their stead. He declared the release of women who had been detained for their protests on March 8. However, massive protests started up again the weekend of April 6 to 7. On April 11, the military overthrew al-Bashir in a coup. By April 10, soldiers had started defending demonstrators against security personnel. Pertinently, his resignation came about as a result of a coup spearheaded by the SAF under General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and the Rapid Support Forces RSF, led by Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo. After the removal of President Omar al-Bashir, the army formed the Transitional Military Council (TMC) to govern Sudan. Despite Bashir being imprisoned, protests demanding civilian rule persisted. In June 2019, the TMC's forces, including the Rapid Support Forces RSF and the Sudanese Armed Forces SAF, carried out a brutal crackdown known as the Khartoum Massacre, resulting in numerous deaths and assaults. In August 2019, under international pressure, the TMC agreed to share power with civilians, creating an interim government called the Transitional Sovereignty Council, led by civilian Prime Minister Abdel Fattah. Elections were planned for 2023. However, in October 2021, the military staged a coup led by SAF's Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and Hemedti, dissolving the transitional government and taking control. Following the coup, Sudan's economy worsened, prompting protests demanding a return to civilian rule. Tensions between al-Burhan and Hemedti grew, especially over al-Burhan's reinstatement of old Islamist officials from Bashir's era, which threatened Hemedti's RSF due to their ethnic background and past hostility from these officials. In early 2023, clashes began between the RSF and SAF, especially over the integration of RSF into the army, which was a major point of contention. On April 11, 2023, the RSF's movements in Khartoum led to confrontations, and by April 15, the RSF launched attacks on SAF bases in key locations, escalating into full-scale conflict. Before this conflict, Sudan has witnessed several devastating conflicts. Sudan obtained independence in 1 January 1956. However, the struggle for Sudan does not end here. Sudan has involved in internal conflicts before its independence. Geographically, it was a huge country, covering about 1 million square miles and located between some of Africa's most turbulent regions. Internally, the country was strongly divided on ethnic and religious grounds. The wealthy northern section was primarily Arab and Muslim, whilst the southern region was less developed and home to a majority of Christians and animists. This divide fueled two devastating civil wars. 1 year before gaining the independence, the First Sudanese Civil War in 1955 was started. It provided an early indication of the country's deep-seated problems. The main two parties in the war were the Central Government of Sudan and the Southern Sudan Liberation Movement SSLM. Great Britain, Egypt, and the Soviet Union supported the central government, while the SSLM was backed by Ethiopia, Uganda, and Israel. An estimated 500,000 people died during the 12-year conflict. The immediate cause of conflict was that on August 18, 1955, the Equatoria Corps, which was composed mostly of British colonial soldiers from southern Sudan, attempted to disperse a crowd of protesters in the town of Torit, in southern Sudan. The southern soldiers, however, appeared to be sympathetic to the protesters, prompting the central government in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, to replace them with troops from the northern region. It outraged the southern soldiers and mutinied, killing 336 northerners, both soldiers and civilians. News of the Torit mutiny spread, and southern soldiers across Sudan revolted. The war was also influenced by other elements. The majority of people in Sudan's north were Muslims, whereas the majority of people in the south practiced either Christianity or native religions. Ethiopia and the recently independent states of sub-Saharan Africa were the focus of southern Sudanese culture, while Arabic-speaking speakers of the North African dialect identified with Saudi Arabia and North Africa. In 1969, with the military support of the Soviet Union, General Ghaffar Namiri took control of the Sudanese government. However, taking a U-turn shifted course in favor of capitalist invited foreign investors into Sudan. Later on March 27, 1972, the government in Khartoum and the southern rebels signed the Addis Ababa Agreement, which ended the First Sudanese Civil War. The southern region gained some autonomy with the creation of the Southern Sudan Autonomous Region under the terms of the Addis Ababa Agreement. The territory would be governed by its own legislature and executive branch. The Sudanese army and police force would incorporate the Anya Naya soldiers. Nimeri gained prominence and popularity as a result of the Addis Ababa Agreement, both inside and outside of Sudan. The country of Sudan remained in a tense peace for 11 years until a much larger and bloodier conflict called the Second Sudanese Civil War began in 1983. The Second Sudanese Civil War, which lasted from 1983 to 2005, was devastating. This conflict was characterized by severe starvation, extensive crimes, and huge loss of life, with estimates putting the death toll at about 2 million. The violence has caused tremendous displacement and hardship for millions of Sudanese. The Second Sudanese Civil War was conflict between the central government in Khartoum and the Sudan People's Liberation Army (SPLA). The war started in southern Sudan but spread to other places including the Nuba Mountains and the Blue Nile region. 2 million people died in this conflict, but the war also led to the creation of South Sudan as an independent nation in 2011. The terms of the Addis Ababa Agreement in 1972, which ended the First Sudan Civil War, were violated several times. In 1978, President Gaffar Nimeri wanted to take control of the newly discovered oil fields located on the border region between North and South Sudan. In 1983, President Nimeri violated the agreement by imposing Sharia law across the nation and abolishing the mostly Christian Southern Sudan Autonomous Region. Most South Sudanese people and other people who were non-Muslim living in the north were now punished by Sharia law. In response, rebels from South Sudan formed the Southern People's Liberation Army (SPLA), led by John Garang, to fight the central government in Khartoum. As in the First War, child soldiers were recruited by both sides but were more frequently used by the SPLA. In April 1985, a coup occurred. Nimeri was ousted and the new government rescinded his 1983 decree and made other overtures designed to reconcile the North and South. In May 1986, the new Khartoum government, led by Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi, and the SPLA, led by Col. John Garang, met in negotiations for the first time. At the same time, the SPLA and other Sudanese political parties met in Ethiopia, where they fashioned the Coca Dam Declaration, which called for abolishing Islamic law and convening a constitutional conference for the entire nation. A ceasefire and the termination of military agreements with Egypt and Libya, which had provided the Khartoum administration with arms, were among the terms of a peace plan that the SPLA and the Democratic Unionist Party (DUP), a political party in Sudan, agreed upon in 1988. The peace plan was accepted by the government of Sadiq al-Mahdi in February 1989. However, on June 30, 1989, military officers under Col. Omar Hassan al-Bashir overthrew Sadiq al-Mahdi's government with the Revolutionary Command Council for National Salvation (RCC), a military junta. The RCC was aided by a civilian cabinet and was led by a committee of military leaders made up of 15 military officers, which was subsequently reduced to 12. General al-Bashir now held the positions of Prime Minister, President, Chief of State, and Head of the. In July 2002, the government of Sudan and the SPLM reached an agreement known as the Machakos Protocol, named after the town in Kenya where peace talks were held. The talks continued into the following year, and finally on January 9, 2005, the government of Sudan and the SPLA signed the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which ended the civil war. The agreement also called for the creation of South Sudan in 2011, 6 years after the war ended. South Sudan's independence was a huge transformation in the region, but it did not put an end to the larger challenges of conflict and instability in Sudan and the surrounding areas. Keep watching our YouTube channel and do subscribe it.